June 6, 1944, Normandy coast, France, 0458 hours. The horizon was still black, a line drawn between the cold weight of the sea and the softer dark of the sky. Out beyond the surf, the water moved with a strange pulse, as if something enormous was breathing beneath it. To the German sentries watching from the cliffs above, it looked like fog, thick, low, and ordinary. They had seen mist roll in from the channel before, but this mist had sound. Beneath its calm surface came the murmur of engines, thousands of them, a vibration that made the metal of binoculars tremble in their hands. One soldier lifted his field glasses, peered through the gloom, and frowned. "Fishing boats?" he asked. The man beside him laughed and shook his head. "No fisherman sails in weather like this." Still he didn't move. No one did. It was too vast, too unreal, like a rumour that hadn't yet decided to become true. Then the first shape broke the waterline. A low craft, black against the waves, followed by another, and then another. The sea began to fill with them, like a swarm of mechanical insects crawling out of the deep. The air smelled of diesel and salt. Overhead, faint flashes lit the clouds, silent at first, then followed by the long roll of thunder that wasn't thunder at all. On the bluffs above Omaha and Gold, the wind carried the sound inland, a long distant hum that blended with the rustle of grass and the occasional cry of gulls. To the men still half asleep in their bunkers, it was background noise, something that belonged to someone else's morning. The German coast had been quiet for months. Commanders called it the watchtower front, a place of waiting, not fighting. The bunkers were stocked with radios, cigarettes, and the smell of damp concrete. The men stationed there had stopped expecting anything. They cleaned their rifles more out of habit than hope. When they spoke of invasion, it was with a kind of professional boredom. England cannot cross, they said, not through the Atlantic wall. The phrase had become a lullaby, repeated so often that it began to sound like truth. But out at sea, that truth was being dismantled one wave at a time. The 1,500 landing craft, built in shipyards from Belfast to Boston, moved through the swells in silence. Each one carried its own small universe, men clutching helmets, photographs, and the dry terror of waiting. In one boat, a chaplain whispered a prayer that was drowned out by the roar of an engine. In another, a young private vomited over the side and apologized to no one. The air was thick with the smell of exhaust and fear. The water slapped against the hulls like hands impatient for arrival. On shore, German radar operators began to lose the rhythm of their machines. The screens flickered with movement, hundreds of points, then thousands, merging into one dense mass. The officer on duty rubbed his eyes, convinced it was a malfunction. He recalibrated, adjusted the frequency, and saw the same impossible sight. "Herr Hauptmann," he called, "you need to see this." His voice cracked on the last word. The captain came over, cigarette in his mouth, and stared at the glowing swarm. "Probably a diversion," he said too quickly. But even as he spoke, he noticed the dots were moving steadily, unhurried, as if they didn't need to hide. At 0512, the channel stopped being a rumour. The first shells from Allied battleships fell on the coast with a sound that no man ever forgets. A deep percussive thud that seems to move through bone rather than air. The bunkers shook. Dust drifted from the ceilings like dry snow. One sentry dropped his rifle as the ground jumped beneath him. Outside, the sea had turned alive. Lines of boats pushing through smoke, waves breaking over ramps, men crouched low, their faces lit by the brief glow of muzzle flashes. On the beach at Vierville, a German machine gunner blinked into the morning haze and saw what he thought was the end of the world. The sea itself seemed to move toward him, carrying shapes that multiplied faster than he could count. "It looks endless," he whispered. Then his sergeant shouted for him to fire, and he did, more out of fear than courage. The bullets cut into the surf and disappeared. Nothing stopped. Behind him, officers scrambled to reach their radios, shouting for confirmation, for orders, for sense. But the airwaves were chaotic. Overlapping reports, phantom landings, confusion between Calais and Cherbourg. One voice shouted, "They're coming." Another said, "It's a feint." Then the line went dead. The German command, built on precision, had stumbled into noise. By 0600, the coastline was a single roar, ships, guns, aircraft, and the human storm breaking against it. The men inside the bunkers covered their ears, trying to block out a sound that was bigger than sound itself. When they finally looked out again, the horizon was gone. The sea had vanished beneath a carpet of movement. Everything that floated seemed to be alive and coming toward them. In that hour the Germans learned the cost of certainty. They had measured the war in numbers, divisions, tonnage, fortifications, but they had not measured will. The landing craft, those 1,500 floating boxes they once mocked, were now writing the next chapter of Europe's history with steel ramps and human weight. And as the first soldiers stepped onto French sand, soaked and shaking, they brought with them the quiet truth of invasion, that no wall, no gun, no calculation could stop what was already moving. Before sunrise, Normandy had changed from coastline to crossroads, and history itself began to breathe through the smoke. Because sometimes what a nation laughs at in peace becomes the thing that buries it in war. For months before the storm broke, German commanders believed they had already won the geography of France. They spoke of the Atlantic Wall as if it were a continent in itself, a living invincible barrier of concrete, steel and faith. From Norway's cliffs to the beaches of Normandy, they had built it with the confidence of men who mistook architecture for destiny. Every bunker poured, every mine buried, every gun calibrated became part of a story they told themselves, that no army could cross from England and live. In briefings they repeated the same phrases like scripture. The channel is our moat. The wall cannot be breached. The English fear the sea more than our guns. The tone was not arrogance at first, only certainty. Hitler himself had called the Atlantic Wall a miracle of modern engineering, and Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the so-called Desert Fox now charged with guarding France, promised that even if the Allies attempted a landing, they would die before they reached the sand. To the officers gathered around maps in chateaux and bunkers, those words became armour. The generals looked at their fortifications, 15,000 emplacements, 6.5 million mines, and a coastline bristling with artillery, and saw not defences but monuments. Rommel often said, "The invasion will come, yes, but not through here." He tapped the Normandy sector with his riding crop and smiled. Too shallow, too narrow, too obvious. His staff laughed with the quiet relief of men who wanted to believe. They looked across the channel and saw what they expected. English weather, English indecision, English fear. Reconnaissance reported landing craft clustered along southern England, but no one worried. The Germans had watched those same harbours for months, noting the endless training exercises and mock deployments. They concluded that the enemy was bluffing, perhaps preparing a diversion before the real attack in the Pas-de-Calais, where the coastline was shorter and closer to Dover. Intelligence officers, convinced of their own analysis, declared Normandy a secondary target. The Wehrmacht command in Paris agreed. Even when Allied radio transmissions grew frantic in early June, German High Command dismissed them as psychological warfare. "Let them pretend," said General Jodl. "We will wait for the real army." To the soldiers stationed along the coast, life became routine. They played cards, fixed fences, and polished boots already dulled by sea air. The sound of gulls replaced the sound of fear. When they spoke of invasion, it was like talking about the weather, inevitable, but always tomorrow. One private at Pointe du Hoc wrote home that England sleeps behind its fog, we sleep behind our wall, perhaps no one wakes. The complacency was collective, the kind that grows only when routine masquerades as security. Every sign of danger was reinterpreted as reassurance. The aerial photographs of English ports filled with flat-bottomed boats were labelled training craft. Reports of Allied ships gathering in the Channel were chalked up to a feint. Even the strange radar echoes detected in late May, reflections of the dummy invasion force of Operation Glimmer, were laughed off by the officers who studied them. "They are showing us what they want us to see," one major said, "and we're clever enough not to believe it." When Rommel visited the front in late May, he found his men confident, even relaxed. The beaches were fortified with Czech hedgehogs, steel obstacles, and rows of wooden stakes tipped with explosives. The gunners showed him their firing arcs, the engineers their minefields. Rommel nodded approvingly, though a shadow of unease passed across his face. He had fought the British before, and he knew the danger of underestimating them. But when he spoke to his superiors in Berlin about the need for more panzer divisions near the coast, his warnings were met with polite deflection. "The Führer believes the main blow will fall in Calais," they told him. "You have enough." Rommel didn't argue. In the hierarchy of the Reich, doubt was treason disguised as caution. By June 5th, 1944, the Channel seemed calm enough to make the belief feel permanent. Storms rolled through the previous day, scattering fishing boats and grounding aircraft. The German meteorologists predicted more wind, more rain, no invasion weather. Many officers left their posts to attend war games or visit families inland. Rommel himself returned to Germany for his wife's birthday, convinced the storm had delayed the inevitable. In his absence, the Atlantic Wall stood without its watchman. At midnight, when the first paratroopers began to drop into the dark fields behind Utah and Sword, most German units were asleep. The phones rang unanswered. The radar stations reported movement, but no one listened long enough to understand. To the men who had been told the enemy would never come through Normandy, the night sky full of parachutes looked like a dream they couldn't quite believe, the kind that feels absurd even while it's happening. For years they had prepared for invasion with the calm arrogance of men guarding a museum, not a frontier. They trusted fortifications over instinct, doctrine over doubt, orders over imagination. And so, when the Channel began to move, when the horizon filled with 1,500 landing craft carrying the weight of nations, they were caught not unarmed, but unawake. They believed the sea would protect them. But the sea had already chosen sides. June 6th, 1944, 06:15 hours, Omaha Beach. The first landing craft had already dropped their ramps, and the channel that German officers once described as the Wall of Europe was now pouring men, machines and fire onto French soil. For months they had believed that invasion across the Channel was a fantasy, that no army could challenge the Atlantic Wall. But now, as the mist began to lift, the fantasy was moving with rhythm and precision, wrapped in smoke and thunder. In the German bunkers along the cliffs, disbelief arrived before fear. Sergeant Wilhelm Reiner, manning an MG-42 on WN-62 above Colville, squinted through his scope and froze. The horizon, once empty and grey, was thick with ships, their masts like a forest of iron stretching beyond sight. The sea churned with white wakes, lines of boats cutting through the surf in perfect coordination. Mein Gott, murmelte es bewegt sich alles. Everything is moving. His lieutenant leaned beside him, incredulous. It's a decoy. It must be. Calais is the target. But even as he said it, a wave of explosions rolled through the air. The battleship USS Texas and the British cruiser HSS Belfast had opened fire, their salvos tearing through the fog and slamming into the coastline. The ground shook like a heartbeat. Dust fell from the bunker ceiling, and one of the younger soldiers crossed himself without realizing it. They had trained for this, to withstand bombardment, but training doesn't prepare a man for the moment he realizes he is the one being buried. Then came the sound that every gunner dreaded, the whine of rockets from offshore landing craft. The first barrage hit the beach obstacles, sending seawater and sand into the air. The defenders looked through their periscopes and saw hundreds of shapes crawling toward them. Small grey boats bouncing on the surf, each packed with men. Some craft exploded before reaching the shore, shredded by mines or artillery, but more kept coming. There was no end to them. For the Germans on the bluffs, the first clear sight of the invasion was unreal. The landing craft dropped their ramps, and the ocean seemed to spill out its contents. Hundreds of soldiers stepping into waist-deep water, some already falling, some pressing forward. They came through smoke, dragging rifles, packs, and fear that had nowhere to go. To the defenders they looked suicidal. "They keep coming," one machine gunner shouted over the noise. "They don't stop." His commander didn't answer. He was staring through binoculars, watching as the sea itself seemed to give birth to an army. At 06:35, the first Allied troops reached the beach, and the machine guns began their work. The bullets whipped across the sand, cutting down entire rows of men. The Germans fired until the barrels of their MG-42s glowed red, until the smell of cordite mixed with the salt air. For a few moments it seemed as if the old belief might still hold, that the wall would stand. The enemy was pinned, the beach was chaos, the water ran dark. Reports came over the radio. "We are repelling them!" The confidence felt familiar, like slipping back into an old uniform. But that illusion didn't last. The guns began to jam under the heat, and the bunkers filled with smoke that refused to leave. The field telephones crackled, then died. One artillery position inland had already gone silent, destroyed by naval bombardment. When the next wave of landing craft approached, it wasn't infantry anymore, it was armour. Amphibious Shermans, ungainly, slow, but unstoppable, began crawling toward the beach through the surf, their canvas skirts bobbing like waves. To the Germans watching from above, it looked like the sea itself was growing machines. Lieutenant Kurt Walther of the 352nd Infantry Division radioed his command post, voice trembling. "Tanks on the beach! Repeat, tanks on the beach!" The reply came too late. The line went dead before he could finish. The power cables to the coastal batteries had been severed. The chain of command that once stretched from Rommel's headquarters to the lowest pillbox had collapsed into noise. Each position now fought alone, blind and surrounded. By 0730, the sea was no longer blue. It was brown and red. Smoke from burning landing craft hung low over the water, drifting inland like weather. The noise had become unbearable. The scream of shells, the crash of collapsing bunkers, the steady mechanical pulse of engines pushing towards the shore. One German corporal threw down his headset and shouted, "Das ist kein Krieg mehr. Das ist das Ende. This isn't war anymore. This is the end." At Vierville-sur-Mer, a forward observation officer climbed out of his trench to see for himself. What he saw made his breath catch, the entire coastline alive with movement stretching from horizon to horizon. Landing craft still arriving, men still pouring out, tanks crawling up the sand like insects made of steel. Above them, the sky was filled with the faint drone of hundreds of aircraft. Paratroopers descending in the distance, flares blinking through the clouds. The scale of it was incomprehensible. No strategy, no fortress, no line of concrete could stop what was happening. By 0800, German officers who had laughed at the idea of 1,500 floating coffins now watched those same boats deliver an army onto their doorstep. The invasion they thought impossible had become something almost divine in its inevitability. A storm not of nature but of design, executed by men who refused to stop moving forward. The Atlantic Wall was still there in name, but it no longer existed in spirit. Its guns fired, its soldiers fought, but its purpose, to keep the sea out, was already broken. Rommel, still hundreds of kilometres away in Germany, would later hear the reports and refuse to believe them. "Normandy?" he asked. "That cannot be." But even as he spoke, his men were already being overrun, their radios captured, their strong points swallowed by smoke. The laughter that had once echoed in briefing rooms was gone, replaced by a stunned silence that stretched from the beaches to Berlin. For years they had built their faith on the stillness of the Channel. Now that same water was moving faster than history could record it. The Germans had thought the sea was their shield, but that morning it was the Allies' weapon, and it was already too late to stop it. By mid-morning on June 6, 1944, the myth of German control dissolved under the weight of arithmetic. The Atlantic Wall, that monument to static defence, was never meant to confront what the Allies had built in secret, an invasion powered not by courage alone, but by numbers so vast they defied imagination. To the German soldiers trapped in their bunkers, it felt like the sea itself had turned against them. But behind that sea was a machine, industrial, logistical, human, stretching across oceans and continents, all synchronized for this single hour in history. The scale of what was coming ashore was beyond anything Europe had seen. By noon, 156,000 Allied soldiers had landed, or were landing on 5 beaches. They arrived in waves that seemed endless. 5,000 landing craft, 289 escort vessels, and 277 minesweepers filled the channel from horizon to horizon. The armada included battleships so large that their shells could level entire hillsides, the USS Texas, HMS Rodney, HMS Warspite, and others whose guns boomed with the weight of cities collapsing. In a single hour, the Allied Navy fired over 25,000 rounds onto the Normandy coast. Each explosion was not just fire, but calculation. Every blast the result of years of production, of factories humming in Detroit, Glasgow, and Sydney. Behind those guns stood an empire of logistics. The Allies had built 1.5 million tons of equipment, all for one purpose: to cross 21 miles of open water and shatter a myth. Every tank, every rifle, every crate of ammunition had crossed the Atlantic under threat of submarine attack. Every jeep that rolled off a landing craft was the result of a continent's faith that planning could defeat fear. The Germans had mocked the landing craft, those stubby, awkward boxes with flat hulls and folding ramps, calling them floating coffins. Yet now each one was alive with movement, men from every corner of the free world stepping into history as though it had been waiting for them. Inside their bunkers, German officers tried to count what they were seeing, but the numbers refused to stay still. Their binoculars showed not one army but many: Americans at Omaha and Utah, British at Gold and Sword, Canadians at Juno. They watched destroyers so close to shore that their hulls scraped the sand, blasting point-blank into their emplacements. The precision was terrifying. One German radio operator described it later. It was not a battle. It was the collapse of mathematics. We were outnumbered by infinity. The Allies had rehearsed every movement. The invasion was not chaos but choreography. 7,000 ships synchronized by tides, weather and timing so exact that even the moon had been calculated into their plan. Behind the beaches, 11,590 aircraft filled the skies: bombers, fighters, transports and gliders. At dawn they had dropped 23,000 paratroopers behind German lines, cutting roads, destroying bridges and sowing confusion before the main assault began. By the time German High Command realized Normandy was the real invasion, it was already too late. The gears of the largest amphibious operation in history were turning too fast to stop. In Berlin, the figures made no sense. Hitler's staff received fragmented reports. 5 divisions landed. No, 10. 30 kilometers of coastline breached. They tried to verify, but communications were collapsing under the noise. The Allied bombers had already destroyed most of the railways leading to Normandy. German reinforcements moved at a crawl. What had been a defensive machine of precision was now a body with severed nerves, twitching, spasming, reacting too late to every touch. By contrast, the Allied advance moved like a living organism. Supply ships followed the first waves, carrying fuel, food, and spare parts. Floating docks, mulberry harbours, assembled from prefabricated sections, began to take shape offshore by nightfall. Engineers worked waist-deep in water, driving pilings into the sand while shells fell around them. Within days, those harbours would offload 9,000 tons of supplies per day, enough to feed and arm 500,000 men. To the Germans watching from the bluffs, it must have looked impossible, a miracle built from steel and noise. Every statistic of the invasion mocked the German faith in fortifications. The Atlantic Wall, stretching 2,400 miles along the coast, had cost 13 million cubic meters of concrete, 1.2 million tons of steel, and 2 years of labour. But in less than 12 hours, the Allies had undone its purpose with organisation alone. German gunners who had been told that the sea is impassable were now firing into an ocean of machinery that didn't stop coming. One bunker commander at Omaha radioed his superior, "I have fired 8,000 rounds. The sea is still full." The human side of those numbers was just as overwhelming. By the end of the day, over 4,400 Allied soldiers were dead, and 9,000 more wounded or missing. Yet the invasion didn't falter. Behind every fallen man stood 10 more ready to take his place. For every craft that sank, 2 more reached the beach. For every tank that burned, a dozen waited aboard transports offshore. It wasn't just firepower, it was persistence given physical form. German officers in the rear tried to rationalize the reports. "They cannot sustain this," one colonel said at midday. "They will run out of ships." But the ships kept coming. By nightfall, the Allies had landed over 2,000 tanks, 20,000 vehicles, and 170,000 tons of supplies. The sea routes between England and France were so dense that from the air they looked like roads drawn across the water. Even Luftwaffe pilots, circling helplessly above, described the sight with awe. It was as if a continent was moving. In the span of 24 hours, German confidence, built on years of victories and calculations, collapsed under the weight of industrial truth. The war that they had once defined by speed and domination had become a contest of endurance, and endurance was something they no longer possessed. The factories that once built their armour were now rubble under Allied bombs. Their oil was running dry. Their belief was running out faster than both. By the time night fell on June 6, 1944, the figures had turned into something more than history. They had become prophecies. The war that began with blitzkrieg now belonged to logistics. Germany's machines had once conquered continents, but now it was the quiet arithmetic of Allied production, the welders, the riveters, the shipbuilders, that decided the fate of Europe. And as the last landing craft came ashore under a sky still flickering with fire, one truth became clear. The Reich had prepared for a battle of strength, but the Allies had brought a war of numbers, and in wars of numbers, belief burns faster than fuel. June 7th, 1944, the day after the impossible had become routine. The beaches of Normandy no longer roared with chaos, they breathed. Smoke hung low like a ceiling. The sea, once a field of thunder, now rolled with a patient rhythm littered with wreckage. The dead, the burned-out hulls of landing craft, the strange quiet debris of invasion. But beneath that quiet, the ground itself had begun to move. Convoys rolled inland. Engineers carved roads through hedgerows. Tanks idled beside churches turned to rubble. What the Germans had called a raid the night before had already become a bridgehead. 80 kilometres of coastline transformed into a living artery of war. For the German commanders who had laughed at the idea of 1,500 landing craft, the shock was no longer disbelief, it was paralysis. Reports flooded headquarters faster than they could be understood. Utah breached, Omaha breached, Gold Beach under Allied control. The messages blurred together until the words lost meaning. Radio operators spoke in hoarse voices. Generals repeated orders that no one could execute. Maps were covered in red pins, but the front no longer existed as a line. It was dissolving, flowing inward, like ink spreading through paper. At dawn, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's car raced along narrow Norman roads, its tyres cutting through dust and panic. He had returned from Germany hours too late, his uniform still smelling faintly of home. As he approached his command post near La Roche-Guyon, he saw the sky to the north burning faintly orange, a horizon on fire. "So it has begun," he murmured. When he entered the operations room, the officers snapped to attention, eyes hollow from a sleepless night. One handed him the latest report. Enemy forces have established a continuous front between Carentan and Bayeux. Rommel read the line twice. "Continuous?" he asked. "Already?" The officer nodded, his mouth dry. Rommel's first instinct was to counterattack. He demanded his panzer divisions, 21st, 12th SS, Panzerlehr, to strike immediately, to throw the Allies back into the sea. But his subordinates hesitated. The divisions were scattered. The Luftwaffe had no air cover. The roads were clogged with wreckage and refugees. Allied planes controlled the skies. Every time a column tried to move, it was hunted from above. Typhoons swooping low, their rockets ripping through convoys like scythes. One officer told Rommel, "We can no longer move by day." That sentence marked the quiet end of the blitzkrieg era. The war of speed had turned into a war of stillness. At the same hour, near Caen, a group of German tank commanders gathered around a wrecked Panther, its armour blistered from a direct naval hit. They spoke in low voices, not of tactics, but of disbelief. "They came through the sea," one said, his hand resting on the still warm metal. "Through the sea." Another spat into the dirt. "We built walls for storms, not for oceans." They had once been the sharp edge of the Wehrmacht, men who measured victory in kilometres gained before breakfast. Now they measured it in metres held before annihilation. The flip had already happened, not on the maps, but in the minds of men. In Berlin, Hitler still raged about Calais, insisting Normandy was a diversion. "The main invasion will come later," he shouted, pounding the table. But his words reached no one who mattered. The men in the field no longer believed. Every order that came from above arrived too late, like a ghost trying to command the living. By the time the Panzerlehr division finally moved, its tanks were ambushed by Allied airstrikes within minutes, their columns broken before they reached the front. Smoke rose from the hedgerows, thick and black, curling into the sky like the handwriting of fate. Even the Atlantic Wall itself, that great symbol of permanence, had turned against its builders. The bunkers that once gave protection now trapped men inside as artillery thundered from both sea and air. In some positions, German soldiers fled their own defences, preferring the open fields to the suffocating concrete. The walls echoed with their own irony, built to stop invasion, now serving as tombs. By the third day, the truth was undeniable. The Allies were no longer on the beach, they were everywhere. Supply trucks rumbled through the shallows, cranes unloaded tanks directly onto sandbars, and bulldozers, those unromantic symbols of industry, reshaped the land itself. Rommel watched a reconnaissance photo taken that morning. Rows of ships stretching across the channel like a metallic bridge, aircraft carriers at anchor, destroyers patrolling the edges, freighters unloading in steady rhythm. The photo showed more than invasion. It showed permanence. "They will not leave," he said quietly. "They have come to stay." At St. Lo, an exhausted radio operator recorded what would become one of the last coherent German transmissions from the beachhead. His voice cracked as he spoke. "We are out of ammunition, artillery gone, tanks destroyed. They come like the tide." When his transmission ended, he sat in silence for a long time, staring at the wires that no longer carried orders, only echoes. The Wehrmacht had built its legend on momentum, on the idea that the German army could never be overtaken, never be forced to react. But in Normandy, they were reacting to something too vast to stop. Every counter-attack dissolved before it began. Every tank burned before it reached the front. The sea that had once protected them was now the enemy's highway. The air once blue with confidence now hummed with Allied planes so constant that the sound itself became part of the weather. When the sun set on June 7th, Rommel stood outside his command post and watched the horizon flicker with artillery. Somewhere beyond that fire, the armies of the world were crawling inland, pulling France out from under him. He turned to his aide and said, "The war is lost here. The only question left is how long it takes for Berlin to understand it. The turning point wasn't a single explosion or battle, it was realization. The German war machine, once the symbol of movement, had met something greater than speed, endurance. The laughter that once filled officers' messes had turned to silence, and in that silence was the sound of empires collapsing. By the end of June 1944, the beaches had turned from battlefield to harbour. The sea that once screamed now whispered against breakwaters of twisted steel and sun-bleached wood. Everywhere the air smelled of salt, oil, and the faint sweetness of grass beginning to grow again through sand. The invasion that shattered the Atlantic wall had settled into rhythm. Cranes lifting crates, engineers laying track, chaplains burying the dead. Men no longer shouted, they spoke in murmurs. The noise had left their ears but stayed inside their skulls. Along the bluff above Omaha, a German medic knelt beside the ruins of a bunker, his hands still black from smoke. Around him lay comrades who had believed in the wall as if it were a living thing. He moved among them silently, tagging what was left, his face expressionless. Below, American engineers dismantled obstacles, dragging steel crosses into piles that clanged like bells when they fell. One of them looked up at the medic for a long moment before returning to work. Neither saluted, neither hated. They were simply two exhausted men tidying the wreckage of belief. At dusk the tide rolled in heavy and slow, carrying wrecked landing craft back toward the shore like memories refusing to leave. Fishermen from nearby villages, their boats newly returned to the water, steered carefully among the debris. They salvaged rope, planks, and bits of metal, muttering about how war left nothing untouched, not even the tides. On the beaches where thousands had died, French children now searched for badges and helmets, treasures from a storm they were too young to understand. Inside the captured bunkers the air was damp, smelling of rust and cordite. American soldiers used them as temporary quarters, hanging laundry over machine-gun apertures. At night they listened to the wind whistle through cracks in the concrete, and wondered how anyone had thought these walls eternal. One private wrote in his journal, "We fought ghosts made of cement. They didn't know we were real until we climbed inside." His handwriting faltered halfway through the sentence, smudged by rain. Farther inland, in the hedgerows near St. Lo, the German survivors moved south in small groups, disoriented, hungry, carrying what little still worked. Some surrendered to villagers, others wandered until captured. Their officers no longer spoke of counterattack. They spoke of home, of families they hadn't written to in months. A few still insisted that new weapons would change everything, but even they said it without conviction. The great engine of Blitzkrieg had slowed to a crawl, its gears filled with mud and regret. For the Allies, the victory brought no celebration, only momentum. Supply trucks rolled ashore day and night, their headlights dimmed to slits. Men ate standing up, slept sitting down, dreamed without sound. The chaplains buried rows of bodies wrapped in canvas, their helmets placed neatly at their feet. Someone carved small wooden crosses from ammunition boxes. Someone else played a harmonica that sounded more like wind than music. The war had moved inland, but its echo remained on the shore, an ache that never stopped pulsing. In the small towns now behind the front, life began to return in hesitant gestures. A baker in Arromanches lit his oven again for the first time in years. The smell of bread drifted through streets still streaked with smoke. A young woman patched the holes in her window with cloth torn from a German flag. The occupying army was gone, but its silence lingered like a ghost between walls. The people spoke softly, as if afraid that loud voices might summon it back. By July, the beach was an open-air workshop of humanity. Engineers, medics, prisoners, farmers, all worked under the same grey sky, each repairing a different piece of the world. A line of captured Germans shoveled sand to clear a road, while American MPs watched from the dunes. When the noon whistle blew, everyone stopped at once. For a few minutes there was only the sea, steady and indifferent. That was the true aftermath, not victory, not defeat, but the collective exhaustion of men who had seen too much motion and too little meaning. The Atlantic wall had fallen, and with it the illusion that anything built by fear could outlast the will to change. What remained was quieter, the sound of hammers, the whisper of surf, the murmur of languages mixing in relief. Somewhere in the sand a single helmet filled with rainwater reflected the sky. A gull landed beside it, tilted its head and flew away. The war for that moment seemed to pause, not over, not forgiven, but breathing. Every empire believes it understands inevitability, until history reminds it that inevitability belongs to no one. For years the German High Command had trusted in walls and mathematics, in the precise language of fortifications and firepower. They believed that by measuring tides and trenches they could measure destiny. But Normandy proved that human resolve cannot be graphed. The 1,500 landing craft they mocked were not machines of war alone. They were proof of something far more dangerous, the coordination of faith and labour, imagination and necessity. The Atlantic Wall had been built by hands that no longer believed in anything but obedience. The invasion, by contrast, was built by hands that believed in each other. That was the difference between power and endurance. The Germans calculated their defences, the Allies imagined their possibilities, and in war, imagination always outlives control. Normandy was not just a military event. It was the moment when machinery and humanity fused into something unstoppable. The tanks, the ships, the landing craft, even the smallest bolt, all of it was an extension of human persistence. The same persistence that worked in factories by candlelight, that tested engines in frozen shipyards, that crossed oceans knowing they might never return. When those ramps dropped on June 6th, it wasn't merely armies stepping onto the sand, it was the collective weight of every small act of courage that had kept civilization breathing through the dark. For the German soldiers it was the end of certainty. The Atlantic Wall had been their myth, a physical embodiment of faith in order, in authority, in unbreakable lines. But the invasion proved that no line holds forever, and that fear disguised as confidence is the easiest wall to breach. The men who once laughed at Allied landing craft learned too late that laughter cannot hold back the tide. There is a lesson that repeats itself across centuries. When men build fortresses to keep change away, they end up burying themselves inside them. The Atlantic Wall was not destroyed by the sea. It was destroyed by belief in its own permanence. Concrete cracks, steel rusts, and arrogance ages faster than both. The story of Normandy is not just how an army crossed the Channel, it is how the world crossed from despair to momentum. The invasion was not the victory. It was the beginning of movement after years of paralysis. The sound of those engines in the dawn was the sound of history waking up. And perhaps that is what the sea remembers most. Not the gunfire or the smoke, but the rhythm of men who refused to stop advancing. Autumn 1944, the wind on the Normandy coast carried a different sound now. The gulls had returned, and the ocean had begun to erase the scars of the June. The beach that once shook with the weight of the nations now moved gently under the tide. The water, indifferent and eternal, smoothed over the wrecks of landing craft buried beneath sand. Children from nearby villages played among the rusting obstacles, unaware that beneath their feet lay the bones of 2 armies and the memory of a morning when the world shifted. Inland, the hedgerows still smelled of gunpowder when the rain came. Farmers ploughed through fields that had once swallowed entire divisions, their blades scraping helmets and the twisted metal of tanks. Every furrow unearthed a fragment, a boot, a buckle, a shell casing stamped with a date that no longer felt real. They collected them quietly, setting them beside fences as if waiting for someone to return and claim them. The war had moved east, but its shadow stayed behind, long and patient. By winter, Allied supply lines stretched from the beaches all the way to Belgium. The Mulberry harbours, those floating docks once dismissed as fantasy, were still working through storms that broke steel and logic. In a single day, they unloaded more cargo than any German port could have imagined in a month. The beaches that had begun as chaos were now blueprints for an army that no longer stopped. The same ramps that once dropped men into hell now lowered trucks filled with food, fuel and mail, the ordinary lifeblood of a force that had crossed from survival to dominance. In a captured bunker near Omaha, an American officer sat at a rough wooden desk using a German map of the Atlantic Wall as stationery. He wrote to his wife back in Boston, the pencil trembling from exhaustion. "It's quiet now." Too quiet to believe what this place used to be. The sea keeps coming in, but it sounds like breathing instead of war. He folded the note carefully and tucked it into an envelope made from salvaged ration paper. Somewhere behind him, the waves tapped against the shore like the soft ticking of a clock that refused to stop. For the Germans who survived, the beaches became a kind of mirror. The men who had once mocked the Allied landing craft now helped bury their fallen comrades in neat rows overlooking the same sea. Prisoners were put to work clearing mines, their hands steady but their eyes far away. They no longer spoke of the wall or of glory. They spoke of weather, of home, of the strange kindness of the enemy who gave them water. One former officer, looking out at the endless line of ships anchored offshore, said quietly, "This was never an invasion. It was the world coming back." When Paris was liberated that August, the news spread back to Normandy like an echo of light. The same roads that had carried death in June now carried convoys of relief. The churches that had lost their bells to war rang again with makeshift ones forged from old shell casings. Even the air felt different, less heavy, less haunted. Yet when the villagers spoke of the morning of June 6th, their voices always lowered. They said the sky had changed colours that day, from grey to red to gold, and that for a few hours the wind itself had carried more voices than they could count. Years later, when the war was long over and the beaches had become pilgrimage sites, veterans returned. Men from both sides, walking slower now, carrying canes instead of rifles. They stood at the water's edge and listened to the surf, each wave a heartbeat from the past. Some cried quietly, others smiled. A few closed their eyes and whispered names into the wind. The sea, as it always does, said nothing. It simply breathed in and out, washing over the memories, softening the noise until only motion remained. At low tide, when the wrecks of landing craft reappeared like bones through the sand, one could almost hear it again. The hum of engines beneath the horizon, the thunder of something larger than men moving through the dark. And for a moment it seemed as though history was still arriving, one wave at a time.